Before you listen to this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a relationship where nothing was obviously wrong, but something inside you kept fading? They weren't cruel, they weren't absent. They didn't hurt you on purpose. And yet, over time, you stop recognizing yourself. You learn to ask for less, to speak softer, to need less, just to keep the peace. This isn't a story about heartbreak. It's a story about what happens when loving someone slowly costs you yourself. If you've ever felt lonely while lying next to the person you loved, if you've ever wondered why being understood felt like too much to ask, stay. Because this story might explain what you've been feeling without having words for it. I didn't stay because I was weak. I stayed because little by little, I learned how to become smaller. Not all at once. Not in ways anyone else could see. Just enough to fit into the quiet he offered. And by the time I noticed, I couldn't recognize who I was anymore. I didn't lose him. I lost the version of myself I used to be. People think losing someone always looks dramatic. Crying, begging, doors closing too hard. But this didn't look like that. This looked like waking up one morning and realizing you no longer knew what you wanted. It looked like staring at your phone, typing something honest, and deleting it before it ever had a chance to exist. It looked like choosing silence, not because you had nothing to say, but because you were tired of explaining why it mattered. At first, I told myself it was normal. Love requires compromise, right? Understanding, patience. So when he didn't ask how my day really was, I filled in the blanks myself. When he listened but didn't respond, I told myself he just processed things differently. When my feelings landed softly, without weight, without urgency, I convinced myself that not everything needed a reaction. I became very good at understanding him. So good that I stopped asking to be understood. I didn't notice the cost at first, because it never felt like sacrifice. It felt like maturity, like emotional intelligence, like being easy to love. I stopped bringing up the things that made my chest feel heavy, not because they stopped hurting, but because I didn't want to turn into too much. I learned which parts of myself were welcome and which ones made the room feel colder. So I adjusted. I smiled when I felt unseen. I nodded when something inside me wanted to protest. I told myself, this is fine, so many times that it almost sounded like the truth. Almost. The strangest part is, nothing was technically wrong. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. He didn't tear me down with words. That's what made it harder. Because how do you explain a loss that happens quietly? How do you grieve something that fades instead of breaking? I kept waiting for a moment that would justify my pain. A fight, a betrayal, something obvious, but it never came. Instead, there were evenings where I felt lonely sitting right beside him. Moments where I wanted to reach for connection and stopped halfway there. Thoughts I swallowed so often they no longer tried to surface. Somewhere along the way, I learned that love, at least in this version, meant shrinking. Shrink in my needs, shrink in my voice, shrink in my expectations, not because he asked me to, but because I wanted to stay. That's the part people don't talk about enough. No one tells you how easy it is to disappear when you're trying to be loved, how you can slowly abandon yourself, not out of fear, but out of hope. Hope that if you ask for less, you'll finally be enough. Hope that if you don't rock the boat, it won't drift away. Hope that being quiet will somehow make you chosen. I didn't wake up one day and decide to lose myself. I just made small choices. Over and over again, I chose understanding over honesty, peace over expression, his comfort over my truth. And each choice felt harmless on its own. Until one day, I couldn't tell where I ended and the silence began. I remember standing alone in the kitchen, the light dim, the room quiet. Nothing had happened, nothing was wrong, and yet I felt empty in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to remember the last time I had spoken freely, the last time I had laughed without checking if it was too loud, the last time I had shared a thought without rehearsing it first. The answers didn't come easily. That was when it hit me. Loving him didn't hurt, becoming smaller for him did. I had spent so much time trying to make the relationship work that I never stopped to ask what it was doing to me. I was still there, still showing up, still loving, but I was doing it without myself. And maybe that's the most painful kind of loss. Not the one where someone leaves you, but the one where you slowly leave yourself and no one notices. I wish I could say this realization changed everything instantly. That I stood up, that I spoke my truth, that I walked away with clarity and strength. But it didn't happen like that. Awareness doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, like a thought you can't unthink, like a feeling you can't push back down, like a truth that settles into your chest and refuses to leave. I didn't know what I would do next. I only knew this. No love should cost you your voice. No connection is worth the slow erasure of who you are. And for the first time in a long while, I started to wonder what it would mean to choose myself again. But that understanding came later. Before I became quieter, before I learned how to soften my edges, there is a version of me who didn't have to think so hard about being loved. I didn't used to measure my words. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head before speaking. I didn't wonder if my feelings were too heavy to place gently in someone else's hands. I was expressive, not loud, just open. I shared things as they came to me. A thought, a feeling, a small moment that mattered. I believed that the right person would want to know all of it. I remember how natural it felt back then. To laugh without checking the room. To talk about my day without summarizing it into something more acceptable. To feel something deeply and trust that it deserved space. I didn't apologize for needing reassurance. I didn't apologize for asking questions. I didn't apologize for caring. That version of me wasn't perfect, but she was present. She took up space without fear. She believed connection grew from honesty, not restraint. She trusted that love didn't require constant self-editing. When I look back now, that's what stands out the most. Not how happy I was, but how whole I felt. I didn't think of myself as too much. I didn't wonder if my emotions were inconvenient. I didn't confuse being easy to love with being easy to ignore. I spoke when something felt off. I reached for closeness without hesitation. I believed that if something mattered to me, it mattered, period. And maybe that's why the change was so subtle. Because it didn't start with rejection, it started with adjustment. At first, it felt reasonable. He listened, just not deeply. He cared, just not consistently. He stayed, just not emotionally present. So I filled in the gaps. I told myself not everyone expresses love the same way. I told myself I didn't need verbal reassurance to feel secure. I told myself my needs were flexible. That's the thing about flexibility. It sounds healthy. It sounds mature. It sounds like growth. Until you realize you're the only one bending. I didn't stop being myself all at once. I paused. I softened. I adapted. When he didn't respond to something important, I told myself it wasn't the right moment. When he seemed distant, I told myself not to overthink it. When I felt unseen, I told myself love wasn't about being seen all the time. I was still me, just quieter, just gentler, just less demanding. I remember the first time I didn't say something that mattered. It wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a feeling in my chest that said, this might not land well, so I let it go. And nothing bad happened. That's what made it dangerous. The world didn't collapse. The relationship didn't end. He didn't leave. So my silence felt justified. That became the pattern. Each time I held something back, I told myself I was protecting the relationship. Each time I swallowed a feeling, I told myself I was being understanding. I thought I was choosing love. What I didn't realize was that I was slowly choosing absence. The version of me I used to be would have noticed sooner. She would have questioned why her feelings needed so much filtering. She would have wondered why connection felt one-sided. She would have asked why love required so much restraint. But that version of me trusted herself, and I was learning not to. I began to doubt my reactions, my interpretations, my instincts. If something hurt, I asked myself if I was being sensitive. If I felt lonely, I asked myself if I was expecting too much. If I needed reassurance, I asked myself why I couldn't just be okay without it. Slowly, my inner voice changed. It stopped saying, "This matters," and started saying, "Don't make this a big deal." I didn't notice how often I minimized myself. Not until I started missing her. I missed how easily I used to speak. I missed how freely I used to feel. I missed how I didn't have to earn emotional safety. Sometimes, I caught glimpses of her, in old messages where my words sounded alive, in memories of conversations that flowed without effort, in moments when I laughed alone and remembered what it felt like to be unguarded. Those moments felt strange, like recognizing someone you used to know and realizing you don't know where they went. I didn't resent him. That's important to say. He didn't take something from me. I gave it. I offered pieces of myself quietly, believing that love meant compromise. I traded clarity for calm, expression for peace, truth for stability. And at the time, it felt noble. It felt like growth. It felt like maturity. It felt like love. But love isn't supposed to make you forget who you were before it. The more I adjusted, the less room there was for the old me. The one who spoke without rehearsing. The one who trusted her feelings. The one who believed that being seen wasn't a privilege. It was a foundation. I didn't hate who I became. I just didn't recognize her. She was careful, measured, always checking the temperature of the room before speaking. She wasn't unhappy all the time, just muted. And that scared me more than sadness ever could. Because sadness asks to be felt, but numbness convinces you that this is just how things are now. I didn't know when it happened. The exact moment the old me stepped back. The moment I stopped reaching instinctively. The moment my needs learned how to whisper. I only knew this. Somewhere along the way, the version of me who believed she deserved to be fully known made herself smaller, so she wouldn't have to ask for more. And that realization didn't come with anger. It came with grief. Grief for the woman I used to be. Grief for how easily she trusted. Grief for how she thought love would meet her where she stood. I didn't want to go back to her. I just wanted to understand why I felt so far from her now. That question stayed with me, quiet, persistent, uncomfortable, and it followed me into the next phase of the story. The part where I would finally start to see how small choices, repeated over time, can change everything. I didn't wake up one day and decide to become smaller. It happened so quietly that, for a long time, I thought nothing was happening at all. There was no moment where I said, from now on, I will disappear. No agreement, no promise. Just a series of small adjustments I barely noticed, until they became the way I lived. It started with listening more than I spoke. At first, that felt generous, attentive, loving. I wanted to understand him. I wanted to be supportive. I wanted to be someone who made things easier, not heavier. So when conversations drifted toward him, I followed. When my thoughts came up, I waited for a better moment. When my feelings felt complicated, I told myself clarity could come later. Later became a habit. I learned how to read his silences. How long was too long before it meant disinterest? Which pauses were normal and which ones meant I should pull back. I paid attention to the smallest shifts, a shorter reply, a delayed response, a tone that felt flatter than usual. Instead of asking what changed, I changed. I softened my questions. Instead of, "Are you okay?" I said, "It's fine." Instead of, "I miss you," I said nothing at all. Instead of, "That hurt me," I told myself it probably wasn't meant that way. Every time I chose silence, I told myself I was being understanding. Understanding became my favorite excuse. I understood that he was busy. I understood that he wasn't expressive. I understood that not everyone shows love the same way. What I didn't understand was why I was always the one doing the adjusting. I started editing myself before I spoke. I'd form a sentence in my head, then soften it again, then delete it entirely. Not because it wasn't true, but because I didn't want it to sound like a complaint. I didn't want to be the reason things felt heavy. I didn't want to be the one who asked for more. I didn't want to risk being seen as needy, so I became careful. Careful with my words, careful with my emotions, careful with my expectations. I remember moments where I felt something strongly, joy, sadness, excitement, and instinctively looked for him to share it with. And then I stopped. Not because he wasn't there, but because I wasn't sure he wanted to be. That uncertainty changed everything. I learned how to keep things to myself. At first, it was just the small things, a thought about my day, a feeling that passed quickly, but then it grew. I stopped sharing when something hurt, because explaining it felt like too much work. I stopped asking questions because I didn't want the answers to sound like indifference. I stopped reaching out emotionally because it was easier to pretend I didn't need to. Each time I told myself this was what love looked like when it matured. Less intensity, less demand, more space. But space, when it's only on one side, doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like distance. I became skilled at making myself low maintenance. I didn't interrupt. I didn't insist. I didn't linger on things that deserved attention. I learned how to be present without being felt. People often say, if they wanted to, they would. But no one talks about the other side of that. The part where you stop wanting them to, because you've learned not to expect it. I lowered my expectations so gradually that I convinced myself I still had standards. I told myself I wasn't asking for much. I told myself I was being realistic. I told myself this was fine, and sometimes it almost was. There were good moments, laughter, comfort, familiarity that made it harder to notice what was missing. I started measuring my needs against his capacity. If he couldn't give reassurance, I told myself I didn't need it. If he didn't ask questions, I told myself I could handle things alone. If he didn't reach emotionally, I told myself I was strong enough not to rely on it. Strength became another excuse. I prided myself on being independent. I didn't need constant validation. I didn't need deep conversations all the time. I didn't need to be emotionally held, or at least, that's what I told myself. But independence shouldn't feel lonely, and mine did. I remember sitting beside him, close enough to feel his presence, and feeling an ache I couldn't explain. Not sadness, not anger, just a quiet longing. I wanted to be known, not in a dramatic way, not in a demanding way, just seen. Instead of saying that, I smiled. I always smiled. Smiling became my way of keeping the peace. It was easier than explaining, easier than risking disappointment, easier than admitting that something essential was missing. I started to believe that wanting emotional closeness was a flaw, that if I were more secure, more grounded, more evolved, I wouldn't need it. So I worked on myself. I became calmer, less reactive, more composed. From the outside, I probably looked like I was growing. On the inside, I was shrinking. I stopped trusting my instincts. When something felt off, I questioned myself first. When I felt hurt, I minimized it. When I felt lonely, I told myself relationships weren't meant to fill every space. I talked myself out of my own feelings so often that eventually they stopped trying to speak. That's how it happens. And not with force, but with repetition. Each time you ignore yourself, it gets easier to do it again. Each time you stay quiet, silence feels more natural. Each time you choose peace over truth, truth learns how to wait. I didn't notice when my needs stopped feeling urgent. I didn't notice when my voice softened into a whisper. I didn't notice when I stopped expecting to be met. What I noticed was the fatigue, a tiredness that sleep didn't fix, a heaviness that followed me into quiet moments, a feeling that something was wrong, even when nothing was happening. I was still showing up, still loving, still trying, but I was doing it on an emotional diet. Just enough to survive, never enough to feel full. I became very good at telling myself stories. Stories about patience, stories about compromise, stories about how love isn't supposed to be easy. What I didn't tell myself was this: love isn't supposed to make you disappear. I kept waiting for reassurance to arrive on its own, for him to notice, for him to ask, for him to meet me halfway without me having to say anything. Waiting became another habit, and habits shape you. One day I realized I no longer knew how to ask for what I needed, not because I didn't know what it was, but because I wasn't sure I was allowed to want it. That realization scared me, because I remembered who I used to be, the version of me who spoke without fear, who trusted her feelings, who believed love could hold her without making her smaller. That version felt far away. I didn't blame him. That's important. He didn't demand my silence. He didn't ask me to shrink. I did that myself, one small decision at a time. I chose not to speak. I chose not to ask. I chose not to expect. And each choice felt reasonable in the moment, until I looked at myself and realized I had built a life where my needs existed quietly, and my presence felt optional. That's the cost no one warns you about. Not heartbreak, not betrayal, but erosion. Loving him didn't take everything from me at once. It took me slowly, and by the time I noticed how small I had become, I wasn't sure how to return to myself. That was the moment everything began to change. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but inwardly. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And once you recognize the cost, you can't pretend it doesn't matter. That awareness didn't fix anything yet, but it cracked something open, and that crack was where the next part of the story would begin. It didn't happen during a fight. There's no argument, no raised voices, no words sharp enough to leave a mark. That's what makes it hard to explain. The moment I realized I was losing myself came quietly. It was an ordinary evening, nothing special, nothing wrong. We were in the same room, close enough to touch, close enough to pretend we were connected. He was focused on something else. I don't even remember what. I remember thinking about telling him something small, something real, and then I stopped. Not because I changed my mind, but because I already knew how it would feel. I knew the pause that would come after my words. I knew the polite listening without curiosity. I knew the way the moment would pass without landing. That knowledge settled in my chest before I could speak. So I stayed quiet. In that silence, something shifted. I wasn't disappointed. I was tired. Tired of translating myself. Tired of softening things that didn't need to be gentle. Tired of pretending that being understood was optional. I looked at him and realized something that scared me. I didn't feel safe to be fully myself there. Not unsafe in a dramatic way, just unseen. That realization didn't hurt like heartbreak. It felt heavier. It felt like grief. Grief for the conversations we never had. Grief for the closeness that never quite arrived. Grief for the version of me who kept hoping it would. I remember sitting with that feeling, trying to push it away. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was tired, that this wasn't the right moment, but the thought stayed. If I can't speak freely here, where can I? I went to the bathroom, turned on the light, and looked at myself in the mirror. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I just looked unfamiliar. My eyes felt distant. My face looked calm, but not alive. I tried to remember the last time I'd felt fully present. The last time I spoke without measuring the outcome. The last time I felt emotionally held instead of emotionally alone. The answers didn't come. That's when it happened. A quiet, undeniable truth surfaced. This isn't love that's hurting me. It's what I'm giving up to stay in it. That thought landed gently, and it stayed. I realized that I had been waiting for him to notice my absence without ever acknowledging it myself. I had been hoping he would ask why I was quieter, why I didn't reach the same way, why I stopped sharing parts of myself. But how could he notice what I kept hiding? I had been disappearing politely. I sat there and replayed small moments, times I chose not to speak, times I laughed something off that mattered, times I accepted less because I didn't want to seem difficult. Each moment felt harmless on its own. Together, they told a different story, a story where I slowly stepped back from myself. I didn't feel angry at him. I felt something worse. I felt complicit, not in a self-blaming way, in a clear, honest way. I saw how much effort I had put into maintaining the relationship and how little I had put into maintaining myself. That balance felt wrong. I thought about how much I had changed, not outwardly, but internally. How my thoughts stayed inside longer. How my feelings waited for permission. How my needs learned to whisper. I thought about the woman I used to be. The one who spoke easily. The one who believed her feelings mattered. The one who didn't feel like closeness had to be earned. I felt a wave of sadness I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not because he didn't love me, but because I had stopped loving myself in the way I used to. I realized something else then. If nothing changed, this would become my life. Not dramatically worse, just consistently emptier. I would keep adjusting, keep understanding, keep making myself smaller, and calling it love. That thought scared me more than the idea of being alone. I went back to the room and sat beside him again. Everything looked the same space, the same silence, the same familiarity. But I felt different. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I wasn't waiting for him to choose me anymore. I was wondering why I hadn't chosen myself. That shift didn't come with confidence, it came with clarity. Clarity that I had crossed a line, not a visible one, but an internal one. I had stayed so long in a space where my needs felt optional that I started to believe they were. I wasn't asking for too much. I was asking the wrong person, and then blaming myself for it. That realization didn't turn into action right away. It didn't lead to a speech or a decision. It led to stillness. A stillness where I stopped explaining things away. Where I stopped minimizing what I felt. Where I stopped pretending this was enough. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew what I couldn't keep doing. I couldn't keep disappearing quietly. That night, lying in bed, I felt something unfamiliar. Not hope, not fear, resolve. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but doesn't go away either. I didn't say anything. I didn't change anything, but something in me had shifted. I had finally seen the cost. And once you see the cost, you can't pretend the price doesn't matter. That realization stayed with me, through the silence, through the routine, through the familiar shape of us, and it waited. Because awareness always comes before change. And in the next part of the story, that awareness would ask something of me. After that night, nothing changed on the surface. We still talked. We still shared space. We still existed in the same routine. If someone had looked at us, they would have seen the same relationship. But I wasn't the same. Something inside me had gone quiet in a different way. Not the kind of quiet that hides, the kind that listens. I started paying attention, not to him, but to myself, to the moments I hesitated before speaking, to the thoughts I swallowed without noticing, to the way my body reacted when I chose silence over truth. I noticed how often I felt the urge to explain myself, and how rarely I felt met. That awareness made it impossible to keep pretending. The truth I could no longer avoid was simple and painful. I wasn't being ignored because I was unlovable. I was being ignored because I was making room for neglect. That thought felt heavy at first, not because it blamed me, but because it gave me responsibility. Responsibility is uncomfortable. You can't be angry at it. You can't run from it. You have to sit with it. I saw how often I chose understanding over honesty, how quickly I dismissed my own needs, how easily I convinced myself that asking for less made me easier to love. I wasn't wrong for wanting connection. I was wrong for believing it was selfish. I realized how deeply I had internalized the idea that my feelings needed permission, that they had to be justified, explained, softened. I had been waiting for him to validate my needs. Without validating them myself, that waiting kept me stuck. I also realized something else. I had been protecting him from my disappointment. Every time I stayed quiet, every time I said it's fine when it wasn't, every time I smiled through discomfort, I was shielding him from the truth. And in doing so, I was betraying my own. That realization hurt, not sharply, slowly. I thought about how often I chose peace at my own expense, how I believed harmony mattered more than authenticity, how I learned to measure love by how little I needed. I told myself I was being patient, but patience shouldn't feel like erasure. I told myself I was being flexible, but flexibility shouldn't mean folding yourself out of shape. I told myself I was being strong, but strength shouldn't require silence. Those thoughts sat with me for a long time. I stopped asking why he wasn't showing up for me, and started asking why I kept showing up for less. That question was uncomfortable, because it had an answer. I stayed because leaving felt like failure. I stayed because I believed love was supposed to be difficult. I stayed because I thought asking for more meant risking everything. But the hardest truth was this: I stayed because disappearing felt safer than being rejected. That truth didn't make me weak. It made me honest. I saw how much of myself I had tied to being chosen, how much I believed my worth depended on someone else's attention, how deeply I feared being seen as too much. I wasn't afraid of losing him. I was afraid of confirming my own doubts. Understanding that changed the way I saw everything. I wasn't stuck because he held me there. I was stuck because I hadn't given myself permission to want more. I had confused endurance with devotion. I thought love meant staying. I thought loyalty meant silence. I thought commitment meant self-denial. But love that requires you to disappear isn't devotion. It's abandonment, self-abandonment. That word stayed with me, not as an accusation, as a mirror. I didn't hate myself for it. I understood myself. I saw a woman who wanted connection deeply, who believed in patience and compromise, who thought love was something you proved by enduring. There was nothing wrong with her intentions, only with the cost she accepted. I began to understand that emotional neglect doesn't always look like absence. Sometimes it looks like presence without attunement, like listening without curiosity, like staying without seeing. And sometimes it survives because someone keeps making space for it. I realized how much energy I had spent hoping he would change, hoping he would notice, hoping he would choose differently. Hope kept me quiet. Hope kept me waiting. But hope without action becomes another way to disappear. I wasn't angry at him. I was disappointed in myself, not for loving, but for believing love meant settling. That disappointment didn't turn into shame. It turned into resolve, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't demand, the kind that decides. I began to feel something shift again. Not urgency, not fear, clarity. I saw that no conversation could fix what I hadn't acknowledged. No reassurance could fill a space I kept minimizing. No love could grow where I kept shrinking. The truth was unavoidable now. I could stay and continue disappearing. Or I could stop abandoning myself. That didn't mean leaving right away. It meant something smaller and braver. It meant honoring what I felt, without apology, without explanation, without waiting for permission. I didn't know how the story would end, but I knew how it couldn't continue. I couldn't keep living a life where my needs felt optional, where my voice waited its turn, where my presence felt negotiable. That awareness didn't demand action immediately. It asked for honesty, and once I gave myself that, everything else would follow. Because the truth, once named, doesn't loosen its grip. It stays. And in the final part of the story, I would have to decide what to do with it. I didn't leave that day. There was no argument, no final conversation, no dramatic breaking point. Just a quiet decision I made with myself. I stopped explaining, not out of anger, not to punish him, but because I finally understood something simple. If someone needs constant translation to understand your pain, they are not listening. They are tolerating. So I became still. Not distant, not cold, just honest in a way I had never been before. I stopped filling the silence for him. I stopped softening my truth. I stopped adjusting my needs so they would fit into his comfort. And for the first time, I noticed how little space there actually was for me. Nothing changed in his behavior. And that was the answer. I realized I had been waiting for him to notice my absence, without realizing how absent I had already been. There is a strange clarity that comes when you stop hoping, not bitterness, relief. Hope had kept me suspended between who I was and who I wanted him to be. Letting go of it brought me back to myself. I began to feel my emotions again. Not the sharp ones, the quiet ones I had buried. Grief for the woman I had slowly erased. Sadness for the love I kept trying to save alone. Compassion for myself, for staying longer than I should have. I didn't hate him. I didn't resent the relationship. I simply saw it clearly. Love wasn't missing. Presence was. And I finally understood that love without presence feels like loneliness with company. The day I chose myself didn't look special. I woke up. I moved through my routine. I spoke when necessary. But inside, something had shifted permanently. I stopped measuring my worth by how gently I could endure neglect. I stopped believing that being easy to love meant being invisible. I started asking myself one question instead. What would honoring myself look like right now? Sometimes the answer was small. Rest, silence, space. Sometimes it was uncomfortable. Boundaries, distance, truth. I didn't announce my decision. I lived it. And slowly I felt myself returning. Not the version of me who hoped endlessly, but the one who knew her value quietly. I noticed how my shoulders relaxed when I stopped waiting, how my thoughts felt clearer without constant self-doubt, how my voice sounded steadier when I didn't second-guess every feeling. I didn't need him to change anymore. That need had disappeared, and that was when I knew. Love should not require you to lose yourself to be kept. It should not feel like shrinking to survive. It should not reward silence over truth. I learned that emotional neglect doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from mismatch, from different capacities for connection, from different levels of awareness, but understanding that didn't mean accepting it. I didn't leave because he was bad. I left because staying meant betraying myself. And that choice, that quiet, uncelebrated choice, was the beginning of something gentler. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in moments. When I said no without explaining. When I felt sadness without judging it. When I allowed myself to want more without guilt. I didn't rush into another love. I rebuilt the relationship I had abandoned the longest. The one with myself. I learned to listen to my discomfort, to trust my emotional responses, to believe that my needs were not inconveniences. I stopped calling my intuition insecurity. I stopped calling neglect patience. I stopped calling loneliness love. And in doing so, I gave myself something I had been begging for silently: care. If you see yourself in this story, know this: you are not asking for too much. You are asking the wrong person, and that doesn't mean you failed. It means you're waking up. Choosing yourself won't always feel brave. Sometimes it feels lonely. Sometimes it feels uncertain. But it never feels like disappearance. And that's how I knew. Loving him didn't end me. Losing myself did. So I chose differently, quietly, and finally, I came home to myself. Healing didn't begin the day I left. It began the day I stopped arguing with what I felt. There was no moment of clarity that fixed everything. No version of me that suddenly felt whole again. Healing came quietly. In the mornings when my chest felt a little lighter. In the evenings when I no longer replayed every word, every silence. In the small moments where I chose rest instead of self-blame. I didn't rush to forgive. I didn't force gratitude for the pain. I let myself feel what needed to be felt without judgment. Some days, healing looked like strength. Other days, it looked like grief, and both were allowed. I learned that healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about returning to who you were before you learned to disappear. Slowly, I stopped questioning my reactions. I stopped minimizing my needs. I stopped apologizing for wanting connection. I learned to trust the discomfort that once scared me, because it wasn't trying to hurt me, it was trying to protect me. I didn't replace one love with another. I replaced silence with honesty. I replaced endurance with self-respect. And over time, the loneliness I feared began to fade. Not because someone filled the space, but because I finally stopped abandoning it. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, if you've ever loved someone who was present but unreachable, if you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, know this: you don't need to heal all at once. You don't need to have answers yet. You don't need to be over it to be moving forward. Healing starts the moment you stop disappearing. And maybe right now, that's all you need to do.